heard someone say we only use 10% of our brains. Well, that's a brain myth, and it's misinformation. Scientists believe that we use our entire brain every day. But do we really know how it works? And do we understand how we make decisions when we are constantly flooded by enormous amounts of information? Good evening, my name is Maia Mazurkiewicz, and welcome to the Anatomy of Disinformation. The brain is without a doubt the least understood organ in the human body. Scientists have actually studied the computing power of neurons. That means they are trying to figure out how neural networks rapidly process massive amounts of information. This information definitely puts an additional burden on that processing capacity. These types of emotional narratives affects our decisions and behaviors. A recent study shows the number of Poles who think the country should accept Ukrainian war refugees has fallen to 53%, down from its peak at 94% in February 2022. 2.5 years into the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, it seems that the Kremlin's influence operations are hitting their targets in European minds. How much do polls and public opinion affect the decisions of governments and politicians? We'll talk about it with our first guest.
Michał Wenzel, lecturer at SWPS University. His academic work focuses on how the media shape political attitudes. He has held research internships at the University of Michigan and the Max Planck Institute in Cologne, and has worked at Oxford University and the Center for Public Opinion Research in Warsaw. Michał's more recent research has concentrated on various aspects of disinformation.
Michał, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today at the studio.
My pleasure.
Today we are discussing of how disinformation is changing our minds. So how is?
Disinformation changes our minds in a perfidious way. We don't even notice it. We don't see how it creeps into our mind and changes the lens of our perception of the world. We do not notice that we are being objects of disinformation because there is a thin line between information and disinformation. It is easy to say what is fake news. Fake news is plainly false. It's something that never happened. But disinformation is not fake news. Disinformation, according to a commonly used definition, is manipulated news in order to change the public opinion for sinister reasons. But it need not be composed of fake news items. Disinformation often consists in real pieces of information, arranged, framed in such a way that they convey a certain view of the world. And we notice these items, we see they are true, but in fact, we are the objects of disinformation.
And very often we don't even know that we are the target.
Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. There are different forces behind disinformation strategies. Sometimes these are states, sometimes these are private companies, sometimes these are news outlets, and sometimes disinformation may occur spontaneously. People create disinformation themselves.
So, for example, we are in Poland right now. That is quite a polarized country. How disinformation added to this?
We live in media bubbles. We tune in to news outlets that confirm our own views of the world. So, different TV stations, different newspapers have varying editorial policies, and we naturally tune in to those that confirm our view of the world. But what happens afterwards? It happens that we only become familiar with one side of the story, with one interpretation of the reality, and we are not aware that some people legitimately view the world through different lenses. And
that's lowering our empathy, first of all, so it's polarizing the other side, right?
it does lower our empathy towards the other side of the spectrum, let's say. We tend to see the others, the people who tune into different outlets with different political views, with different worldviews. We see them as wrong, and there is a thin line between seeing someone as wrong and seeing them as evil.
And that also can change the way how we vote, as we are sitting in the mega election year this time.
Certainly, there is more and more polarization, and the bubbles are connected with political blocs and people who tune into particular media, vote for parties that are supported by these media.
But malign actors are also using disinformation and Operation Influence to influence politicians, because right now politicians are very much making their decisions based on polls. So
that's true. We can see that in case of the war in Ukraine, that many Central European countries are influenced by state-aligned actors aligned to the Russian state that try to influence the public opinion in the Central European countries because they are on the front line, because they are big supporters of Ukraine in its war efforts, and these tactics are played in Central European countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia. And of course, what the public opinion think then influences the politician. You are right, but in order for these tactics to be effective, there has to be a sort of a social background. Some polities, some societies will be influenced by these tactics and some will not.
But those that are using those tactics also know the society and are using different tactics, techniques and procedures in the different societies, correct?
Not necessarily. Our research about the Russian disinformation tactics indicates that, in fact, they are very similar in all the three countries of Central Europe that we studied in our research projects, Central European Digital Media Observatory. The tactics are similar, but the effects are different.
And those effects is something that they could wanted to occur, or is it something that just happened?
Let me give you an example. The Slovak society is much more amenable to Russian narratives about the war in Ukraine. They are much more likely, Slovaks are much more likely to think that Russians have legitimate claims on the eastern Ukraine, that the Ukrainian state is Nazi, that the war was a result of the provocation by Ukraine. And Poles, the least so.
However, the drop in the attitudes towards the Ukrainian refugees in Poland is visible.
The drop is visible, that's true, but still the attitude towards Ukrainian refugees in Poland is much better than in Slovakia or the Czech Republic, which indicates that there's something beyond the malign actions of the actors. So
because the starting point was different as well, right? So That's why. The tactics were similar, but the starting point was different. The let's say soil on which the seeds fell was different. Poles were less amenable to disinformation strategies because of collective consciousness of Poland, perhaps because of the historical experience with belonging to the Russian state, Russian occupation, and so on, which was not the case in Slovakia or the Czech Republic. Thank you so much for explaining this complexity and showing how disinformation is affecting our attitudes. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our report tonight looks at the field research our next guest conducted in Rwanda, the Eastern African country that witnessed a genocide in the mid-1990s.
We lost a lot. our parents, siblings, uncles, aunties, cousins. So as all of Rwandans, Tutsi during that period, who were targeted and were killed.
What I'm doing in Rwanda is actually to recruit former genocide perpetrators, but also rescuers. And I'm interviewing them, but I'm also using neuroscience approach with EEG to try to understand what differ between them. Like, does their brain process the information differently? Do they have different personality traits? In the study we created, we asked them to be in a situation where they have to obey orders to hurt or not another person. It was in an experimental study, but we wanted to see also their behaviors, because we might expect that, okay, the rescuers, perhaps they will just resist more orders from an experimenter to hurt another person. It was a financial pain where they were asked to take money from another person. And actually, I observed no differences at the behavioral results between the perpetrators in that experimental setup and the rescuers. What we did is that we recruited former genocide perpetrators, officially recognized as such, and also people officially recognized as rescuers during the genocide. And we also recruited a control group composed of bystanders. The experimenter gave them orders to take money or not from the research assistants. Of course, in reality, they were not really taking money, but they were told that it would be the case. After, they were left alone in front of the computer where they could make their decisions. They just had a feedback that if they took money, they could see a picture of a research assistant with sadness. Well, if they chose not to take the money, they could see the picture, the face of a research assistant showing happiness. And what we did is that we measured how frequently they would resist this immoral order and instead choose the other option of not taking the money of the research assistants. You know, former perpetrators, they are highly stigmatized regarding what they did. And the fact that I barely observe differences between them and the rescuers may actually suggest that indeed it's more about a context that happened back at that moment, back in 1994. But it may not be the case that they have a special personality trait or a special malfunction in their brains. That would be really too simplistic. We really observed that overall, obeying orders really influences a lot the way our brain processes the information. And these mechanisms, they are also involved in prosociality, like when we choose not to hurt another person. With my research, I tried to start investigating with neuroscience method what is happening in the brain when we follow orders that can explain that somehow our responsibility is blurred and that we are able to hurt someone to an extent that we would perhaps not have done it without having received those orders. Well, of course, during a genocide or war, we have the perpetrators, but we have also seen that there are some people that are less numerous that instead of falling prey to the hateful propaganda diffused during the genocide, they will risk their own life to rescue people from the outgroup, the target people.
As we just learned, analyzing human brain activity to explore how we make moral judgments can reveal why people comply with unethical orders. Emilie Caspar studies the psychological and neural roots of blind obedience and has tried to answer these questions. Why are some people more or less eager to save others? I met Emilie earlier this year at the Nobel Prize Dialogue in Brussels, and since then, I've been waiting for this chance to talk to her.
Emilie Caspar, Associate Professor, Department of Experimental Psychology, Ghent University. Emilie Caspar specializes in social and cognitive neuroscience, investigating the neural mechanisms that underlie moral decision-making. Her recently published book, Just Following Orders, Atrocities and the Brain Science of Obedience, explores how obeying orders affects the brain. Works with different communities all over the world, including former genocide perpetrators and rescuers in Rwanda and Cambodia, as well as inmates and military personnel. Emilie is the winner of numerous awards, notably the ERC Starting Grant and the Early Career Award from the Society for Social Neuroscience.
Emilie, thank you so much for joining us today in here at this episode of The Anatomy of Disinformation, when we are discussing the cognitive science and the way how our brain functions. We just saw the video material on your research experiment around the genocide in Rwanda. And I know that it's not the only experiment that you conducted. You also worked around the Khmer in Asia. Can you explain us how exactly you look at this perspective of the moral judgment and why it's so important?
Yeah, indeed. So I think, first of all, for those topics, like, it's very difficult for the scientists, for the person involved, for everyone. So, of course, I try to use a scientific approach that rely on different methods. So I think it's very important to have to ask the subjective experience of the people who are involved in those atrocities, because of course what they can report is very valuable. But most of the time when we study genocide and the perpetrators of genocide, we have access to them only years after the event of the atrocities. And so I think it's also important to consider that there are limits to subjective experience of what people report. And I think studying the brain in that for these issues is also very important, because in the end, that's the brain that computes information to process it and to reach to a decision to act in such a way or not. And so I think it's very important to have these different approaches.
Exactly, because people, when they are acting in the situations like this, they are very emotional as well, right? And basically acting under stress. In your experiment, are you also trying to build such an environment?
Yeah, so that's very complicated. So of course, when we create experiments, we try to be as ecological, that's the word we use, as possible, in the sense that we try to mimic as possible like a real life situation. But of course, when we do experiments with human beings, especially very sensitive human beings, such as those ones, we have to follow strong ethics rules. And so actually, even if we can study obedience, disobedience, what is happening in their brain in those populations, there are also, we cannot put them in under stress or something very extreme, because they have already suffered so much that we risk to trigger, again, very negative emotions for them. So we have to protect them while at the same time study the phenomenon to try to understand better what happened at that moment.
And what it can, or how it can actually support us, humanity, to understand better what is happening with the brain of humans in order to bring more peace?
Yeah, of course, that would be what I would like to reach. So I think that, honestly, I'm not sure yet what makes that rescuer will act so differently than the perpetrators, where they also receive the same propaganda information. But what I do know is that during genocides where an entire population must be exterminated, some of the victims, they own their life to those rescuers, to those people who just didn't follow what was requested by the government or the regime at that time. And if, of course, everyone would have acted like them, such atrocities would have never occurred. Like authoritarian regimes must not have successes. I think we have really a lot of things to learn from them in order to reach peace. But the difficulty also is that, we all have our moral standards. Like, for instance, we can say, of course, I will never hurt someone else. But during genocides or wars, the problem is that morality is blurred. Because actually, through years of propaganda, you're told that this population, for instance, should be exterminated because it's going to be for the sake of your own population or your own group or your own society. And so actually hurting others during those periods is actually the moral or the right thing to do. And this is what it's very difficult to find a way to counteract these effects.
And Emilie, can you see similar cases, for example, in the war in Ukraine or during mass shootings in US?
Yeah, actually, that's something. When I started studying genocide, I took an interest in the Holocaust, of course, but the genocide in Rwanda, the regime of the Khmer Rouge, and all the perpetrators, most of them reported that they just followed orders, and that was the main reason for their participation into the genocidal regime. And what is interesting that you see that in different cultures, different continents, different periods of time. And when you just look at the newspapers or you just read the newspapers, you see that actually in many, many circumstances, people use exactly the same justifications. So yeah, at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I remember that there was a Russian soldier who shot a civilian in the back and killed him. And as a line of defense, it said, I just followed orders. There was also, I think it was 2 years ago, a mass shooting, among others, in a school in the US. And apparently, while the shooter was still inside the school, the police officers were told not to intervene, and they didn't. Well, yeah, of course, we don't know the details, but it was also a justification, but that they didn't act because they followed orders. Actually, I hear that all the time. So I think there must be something common, because so many different human beings using exactly the same justification must have an origin in the brain.
What about moral judgments? It means to me, when you're telling me that those people are basically taking down their values and just being obedient, right? Is there any way that we can actually support that those values are stronger in people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. What I'm trying to do to answer that question is to try to understand perfectly the mechanism behind this. Because as I mentioned, when they receive orders in a genocidal regime, morality is blurred, and actually killing others may become the right thing to do. And when you interview the rescuers about why they did so, many will, for instance, report that they did it out of compassion and empathy for the victim, that they cannot do otherwise than helping those people. And so perhaps empathy somehow is a key mechanism that helps to really understand the suffering that we cause to others and that help us to say no. But it may also be that other mechanisms are at play. If it was a single one, that would be, of course, too easy. We could just create interventions that would enhance people's empathy, for instance. But from what we have seen in the neuroscience results is that, of course, it's much more complex than that. When we make decisions as humans, a lot of informations are processed. The brain will compute a lot of different information, and empathy is certainly not the only one that can help resisting such orders and save someone's life.
Thank you so much, Emilie, for joining us, and wishing you the best of luck of the further research, and hoping you can bring some of the valuable information around it. And so far, I think empathy, it's something that can save us. Let's remember about that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. And finally, let's take a look at the definition of cognitive warfare.
What is cognitive warfare, and how does it use disinformation to manipulate and influence people? Cognitive warfare targets the mind, aiming to manipulate and influence how people think, feel, and make decisions. It focuses on shaping perceptions and weakening rational thinking by exploiting psychological and emotional vulnerabilities. The rise of cyberspace and social media has amplified the impact of cognitive warfare, allowing disinformation to play a central role in influencing public opinion and undermining trust in reliable sources. A key example is Russia's manipulation of global narratives through fake news and its use of social media campaigns to erode trust and sow confusion, while deploying disinformation to blame Ukraine for the ongoing conflict.
Cognitive science is a fascinating field, one very closely connected to our topic on this show. People today receive as much information in a single day as our ancestors did during their entire lifetimes. It's easy to get lost, especially when our emotions take over. Lucky for us, we still have our brains. We just need to understand the processes that make them tick. Until next week, keep calm and think deeply.